I've been waiting to do this list. I've been waiting to see this list for the last 10 years, actually, when I first started getting into cinema. And I've especially been waiting for the past few months for them to come out with the list. And I'm about a day late on this since I wasn't sure when they were going to come out. So, to start off with, as you can see, I'm a real nerd, so I made my little list here of my 10 picks, and I used, if you're familiar with the font for screenplays, I'm using Courier or Courier Prime as my font to write this list. And of course, the first thing to say is what Roger Ebert once said, which is that it's almost impossible to make a list of the greatest films, a top 10 list, because there are so many great films that you could choose from. Because there's so many great films, I just want to talk about first the films that I would put on my list, and there are a lot of other films to talk about. And then we will, of course, go through the director's list and the critics poll, and I'll comment on if I have any great ideas about the films that they chose. And there is definitely some controversy, so I want to talk about that. No script for this video at all, just exactly whatever comes to the top of my head. So on my list, to start with, you'll notice going down the list of the films that I've chosen that definitely the movies that mean the most to me, the stories that mean the most to me are love stories. I don't care how sappy I sound. Those are really the most inspiring stories to me. And I think those are the most beautiful films, or at least the films that are the most beautiful to me and the most meaningful just so happen to be human stories for the most part. And we can discuss all kinds of things about how great a film is on a technical level and so on. But for me, I've started with 2001, which happened to be the top pick in the director's poll, which I think probably has a little more significance than the critics poll, especially this time around, because there's a lot of critics that are not coming in to give their picks, and I'm not sure who's replacing them. And the same with the directors, to be honest. There's not as many great directors around anymore. And of course, every list is subjective, so. But 2001, I'll just speak about it now for the most part. I think any of Kubrick's films could be on the list. I could make an entire list with any of Kubrick's films. He's my absolute all-time favorite director. I think that 2001, we don't give it enough credit, and we don't give Kubrick enough credit for how human his films really were. But as Roger Ebert said, it's not about how much Kubrick did, but how little for 2001. I actually think it's very human, and one of the most human characters of all time, you could say, is the computer Hal in the film. There's also the story I've said many times, the beginning of 2001, probably the greatest sequence ever filmed, one of the most inspiring sequences ever filmed, the Dawn of Man sequence, because it shows us really the origin of life itself. And the whole film is about where we came from and where we're going. There's so many interpretations about the ending, and that's definitely one of not only the most ambiguous moments in cinema history, but that's one of the great things about art. And I could go on and on. I think that 2001 is a very human film, and it's obviously about something even more than that, which is why, both on a technical level and philosophically, it is as important as any film ever made. So it's an incredible choice to be near the top of anyone's list, and probably the best Kubrick film, and the most important one. Then I have 8.5. I don't have a whole lot to say about 8.5. I haven't seen it in so many years, but I remember that was one of the first foreign films that I watched. I love Fellini. I made a video talking about he's one of the magicians of film history. Definitely one of the pioneers of surrealism, if you want to call it that, and fantasy, one of the great fantasy filmmakers. I saw La Dolce Vita not too long ago. I haven't seen 8.5 in years, but of course, Marcello Mastroianni, he has not only one of the greatest stars in cinema, but there's some iconic imagery of him and his character in the film. A film about making films and about escapism, and it's kind of like a Citizen Kane, the story, somewhat of a autobiographical story. It's a film I think that it would interest anyone, not just someone in the same profession as filmmaking. I think it's just a great adventure story. Um, the technical prowess of that film and the imagination that it captures, I think, is up there with certainly one of the most unique films. I remember being very impressed, so I've always thought I'll go along with most of everyone else's consensus and put 8.5 there. Then we have Blow Up. Blow Up is a film. I also really love Antonioni's films. His only English language film, I think, and it's not the most moving film. I actually think that usually that film leaves me a little melancholy. It's one of those films that leaves me very contemplative at the end of it. But was so fascinated by it the first time I saw it. It definitely reinvigorated my passion for cinema when I saw it. And one of those films that I had to see again right after I saw it, so I remember staying up late at night seeing it a few times in a row. I love David Hemmings' performance. He's an underrated actor. Vanessa Redgrave. The cinematography. Antonioni's very aloof style of filmmaking. There's not a whole lot of dialogue in the movie. But as Roger Ebert said, I think the meaning of the film is that the main character, he tries to run away from his profession. He gets distracted a lot throughout the movie, and there's a little bit of some imagination there. But Roger Ebert said that we will find satisfaction only doing the things we're really good at, and everything else is pretty much a waste of time. And I think that's a great takeaway from that film. I've always remembered that piece of criticism, and I just love the sort of, again, escapist nature of Blow Up. I love the cinematography, the performances, the realism. There's a lot of realism, the diegetic soundtrack. There's a lot of nice touches in that film. Very unique, from a very unique filmmaker. Then we have City Lights, and I think City Lights is one of the most beautiful films, perhaps the greatest acting, as it's been said before by the great critic James G. The final scene of City Lights is as beautiful as anything you'll ever see. It's the purest acting you could ever see. And the universal message of what a man will do for a woman he's in love with, and also just what you would do to help someone out in need. I've made a whole video talking about City Lights, why I think it's the smartest film ever made, and it's an absolute great point to make. Chaplin, I've already talked about it in another video, but City Lights is definitely... I've never been able to see the ending of that without getting emotional. It's magic. City Lights should be on anyone's list. I think it's a film that's disappeared on a lot of critics' lists because I think that making a list is sort of propaganda, and you want to put other choices on there that may need some recognition. So that's kind of, I think everyone loves a great list, and it's amazing because if you're someone who wants to get into learning about any subject, it's a great way to start by looking at a list and going down the list and taking a look at different films that make an appearance on the list. But I think mostly the consensus over time is City Lights. Is no one would ever dispute that that film is one of the most beautiful films ever made. Then, of course, there's Citizen Kane, and I actually want to talk a lot about Citizen Kane. Again, I have old video reviews over almost all of these films. A lot of people put Citizen Kane there just because it's sort of the compulsory choice. I remember seeing it when I was 14, and there's the Vatican's famous list of the films you should see by the age of 14. I actually never saw Bicycle Thieves, but I saw Citizen Kane when I wanted to see what it was about. I remember watching it the first time, and thinking that certainly I could see by the end why it was so acclaimed. But for years I thought about how brilliant that film actually is, and I couldn't believe, that's one of the movies that you see and you almost want to give up trying to make something because it's so well written and so well acted. I love the film. I think Roger said it best, and I mean, I have so many quotes from Roger that I have in my head. I think he was probably the greatest film critic. I don't agree with him with everything, on everything, but when he said that, and I've even used it to describe some video games, he said that Citizen Kane was on the surface as fun as any film ever made, and that its depths surpass understanding. And I pretty much agree with that. There's so many scenes. I don't want to spend the whole video talking about Citizen Kane, but I think Orson Welles' performance and his direction and the fact that you'll never see performances quite like that because he took all of the actors from the Mercury Theater, put them on the film. People praise the Citizen Kane for what it does on a technical level. I think we don't talk enough about the performances and the writing and the storytelling that's really universal. And as I used to say, quoting the scene from the film, with wealth and fame, he's still the same, but not really. That's kind of one of the scenes that's it is really the film that gave us the idea that we could tell a story non-linearly, which is so incredible because Orson Welles came from the theater, and you do not really tell a story in a non-linear fashion necessarily in the theater. You could, but sometimes you would think maybe the audience would be confused that way. Orson Welles found a way to do it, and also to convey information, like the many montages in the film where he skips ahead in time by, I mean, on a technical level, of course, every film that comes after it owes something to it, but I love the storytelling in it, and it's one of my favorite films. As Roger said, another quote from him putting it best, they don't always ask you what your favorite film is, they always ask you what the best film is. But for him, he said it was always Citizen Kane, and I think it's right up there. Next we have Mulholland Drive, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it really warms my heart to see that that made it into the top 10 on the critics poll, number 8 of all time, and I would really want to get to that list very soon. I hoped that it would go up on the list. I remember when I first saw the 2012 list, I wondered how films like In the Mood for Love and Mulholland Drive were ranked so highly, but I remember seeing it. I've seen that movie so many times, one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And I'm just going to say my favorite piece of criticism from David Thompson. I'm not a huge fan of his criticism of his career. He said a lot of contentious things, but he said something that was perfect about Naomi Watts' performance. If that was the only film that she ever did, that her place in cinema history would be without a doubt. It would be cemented by that one performance, and that's some of the highest praise you could ever give to an actor, and it's absolutely true because what she does in that film, and of course the other actors, Justin Theroux is amazing, Laura Elena Haring, everyone else is incredible, and David Lynch is incredible. But that's, one of the greatest love stories out there. It's really one of the most dreamlike films ever made, and I think that's one of the great things about it, even though you can apply actually a pretty simplistic understanding of the events. It's really about how it makes you feel, and it does. So, what a film that came out in my lifetime. So I'm definitely glad that it should be universally seen and adored. Then we have a film that I saw recently, Tokyo Story, another film that is really one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. It's really the definition of art, I think, when you look at Tokyo Story and how human it is, how it's so relatable. I think the imagery in the film, two of the greatest actors I've ever seen, and I've only seen them in this one film. Setsuko Hara is absolutely beautiful. Not only, I think she's one of the most fascinating. She could go through the entire movie without saying a word, and just looking at her, I think you could learn so much. And she's kind of an enigma, actually, throughout the movie. But she's incredible. The imagery just of the poster for the film, which I don't think is actually in the movie, or at least the shot that they used is different from in the film. A story about people who are grieving, longing for both the future and the past, a chance to start anew. Just looking at that imagery, I think it speaks so much to all of us. It's such a beautiful, wholesome story. I love the Japanese, and they're very traditional, and they're very family is very important to them. But as you see in Tokyo Story, that even they don't follow the rules sometimes, and the family's sort of drifting apart. And as I said in my review, and I have a little footage of it, that the message is about time and how time doesn't stop for anyone, and there are changes in life and there are changes in human beings, and it's such a heartbreaking film, but also a very inspiring film. I went a long time before I watched Tokyo Story. I kind of stuck my nose up at it, that I didn't need to see it, that Ozu, for all of the things that we say about his innovations, that I don't know why I said I've seen Kurosawa's films, so I've seen what I needed to see from Japanese cinema, but I was wrong. Tokyo Story really is that incredible of a film and as a piece of art, and there's nothing quite like it. So of course, if that had been chosen, it's very high on the list. If that had been chosen as the best film ever made, I would be fine with that. Then there's There Will Be Blood. There Will Be Blood is a film I saw when I was 10 years old. It was really the movie that I wanted to. After seeing that, I was really fascinated by movies. I was fascinated by how a film could have a concept about, a guy looking for oil. Of course, it's not really about that. It's about his descent into depravity. I love Daniel Day-Lewis's performance, Paul Dano's performance, and the direction and cinematography and all that. But I didn't think that a film like that with a mature subject matter would be able to interest me, but I found it fascinating as a 10-year-old kid. I've always thought that was the best movie of our time, up there with Mulholland Drive as well. And I wasn't sure what else to put to round out my top 10. There are a lot of other films that could come and go, but I've always believed in that, so I put that on my list and give it a vote. I skipped over Singin' in the Rain, but Singin' in the Rain is probably, I said 10 years ago, probably my favorite film of all time. Of course, there are a lot of other stories, but the experience I had with that film was a great one. The few times in life where you go into something with expectations, or maybe you don't, but by the end, you're so amazed by what you've seen. And nothing beats Gene Kelly's Singin' in the Rain. That's just completely magical. Something that actually you would say maybe would only happen in the movies, but that's something that we all aspire to. There's nothing more pure than seeing that. A man singing in the rain because he's in love, and that's a universal message. I love Singing in the Rain. The best musical ever made, and one of the best love stories ever told. And a celebration of movies, a movie about movie making. It's incredible. And I'm really, really glad that that's back in the top 10 on the critics where it belongs. I think it hasn't been there since maybe 2002 or something. Always one of my favorite films. I can not make a list without putting that there. And then we've got Vertigo. Vertigo, I remember seeing it 10 years ago when it was chosen as the best film ever made. I never agreed with that. I thought that was not crazy compared to what they chose this time, which I'll talk about. But I didn't think Vertigo was the best film ever made. And I still don't really agree with that, but there's so many incredible things to say about Vertigo. First of all, one of the most ironic endings and one of the most iconic plot twists of all time in Vertigo. The storytelling is incredible. The movie looks beautiful. I said years ago, if there was a postcard for the movies, if there was an image you could choose, you could go with Singin' in the Rain and Vertigo, the two best, I would say, Technicolor films ever made. Absolutely gorgeous. There's nothing like it. San Francisco, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. James Stewart, one of my favorite actors ever. Hitchcock at his most personal. Kim Novak is great in the film. And understanding that the movie is not about the mystery at all. It's about idealism and how we will do what we will do to change people, even sadistically, into being the people that we want them to be, to fit our idea of how the world should be and how people in our life should be. And even though the film doesn't so much arrive at that message until maybe like the second half of the film, there are clues throughout the whole story. And when you add it all up, that's really beyond the plot of the film. A murder mystery is really the psychology of human beings. And that's another, not just a worthwhile message, that's really one of the great takeaways from movies and cinema as an art form. So those are my top 10 films, which many of them are on the lists for the directors and the critics as well. And so, I'm not writing a script, I'm just sort of going off at the top of my head. So I'm not going to say a whole lot more, I'm just going to look at what they've put on the director's list and the critics list, only the top 100, and I'll give some thoughts on how I feel about the films that I've seen, and I'm not going to make it too much longer. I'll say that there's a lot of omissions. I've seen some people already talking about that. Lawrence of Arabia isn't on there, which it is on the director's list. It's not on the critics list, and for it not to be on the critics list is, I want to say, just plain wrong. I mean, Lawrence of Arabia might be the best movie ever made, as Steven Spielberg once said it was a miracle. So I'm just going to talk about that for a moment, because that's another one of the films that I love, and it's to talk about Peter O'Toole is enough, but also one of the greatest discoveries ever when they found Omar Sharif during the casting of that film, who was, I think, he was like a physics student or something, who had never acted in an English language film before, and then, of course, David Lean went on to put him in Dr. Zhivago, and he became a household name. So many incredible performances, one of the greatest screenplays ever written. Freddie Young, cinematography, I mean, Lawrence Arabia is a masterpiece that might be the best movie ever made. There's Hollywood liberties taken in some parts of it, but fascinating to look at. Let's just look at the critics list first. I was thinking about this before I started to make this video. Like, there are some films on here that are clearly propaganda pieces, and we all understand that that's with any list, or even in this case it's a poll. That's understandable. Is Get Out a better movie than Lawrence of Arabia? Just to single that out at the very top of the list, I don't think so. But Jordan Peele, I think, is. I'll just say I'm not very familiar with his films, but I know that I would say Get Out is probably his best work that he's done as a director. To go from comedy into horror, I think those are two of the hardest genres to work in, and so I definitely think he's brought some originality to his work and made some bold and daring choices. I think Get Out's a pretty good movie. Is it one of the 100 greatest films ever made? Given the omissions, I would say there were more, well, perhaps there's some less deserving films on here, and some weird choices, but just want to highlight that there are a lot of movies off the top of my head that could be on here, and that are not in the top 100. I'll just speak about the films that I know a lot about. So, in general, I was just telling my friend about this, one of Buster Keaton's best. There's nothing like Buster Keaton. The acrobatics that he does in his films, particularly in the general. The danger that he puts himself in at all times, the thrill and the antics and the heartwarming story about someone fighting in the Civil War even is really humanizing, and it's probably as important of a message now as it ever was then. But it's a great piece of filmmaking. The General's great. Some of these I've never even heard of at all or seen. Once Upon a Time in the West, I think great opportunity for me to say the good, the bad, and the ugly should be there instead. But Once Upon a Time in the West has some good performances in it. I actually saw Ugetsu for the first time very recently, a few months ago, and Ugetsu Monogatari Ugetsu is you know, it's been hailed as one of the greatest films ever made. I think it is a very wholesome story about it's a cautionary tale about greed and ambition, and really the most important thing is the people you love. And it's a very sad movie, and there's a little bit of escapism there. I don't think it's as good as some of the other Japanese films, but it is kind of a timeless story, and it is a good film, and so no problem with it being there. I did see Parasite a few years ago. Parasite is pretty good. It's a nice little thriller. Good to highlight more of South Korean cinema. The Shining, of course, speaks for itself. I think more Kubrick films could have representation other than The Shining, but there are a lot of people that think The Shining. I mean, The Shining, actually, I will say, is probably the most iconic film ever made. Uh, just because if you add up all of the references, even though the film is only 40 years old, if you really add up all the references from The Shining, I could list them all off. There's dozens of them. You've got the elevator, the blood in the elevator. You've got the maze. You've got red rum. You've got, when Jack is frozen stiff. You've got the typing scene. You got the axe, which is the image they use, the axe through the door. Uh, there are so many iconic moments from The Shining, and a lot of those were and of course the twin girls, which I think I don't know if there's even another. I can't remember if Stanley. I remember that he was originally, I think, going to cast only one girl, but they came together as twins, and he thought that was put that in there. I don't know if there is another direct reference that he chose, but there's so many twins now that's become utterly iconic from that film. So The Shining, um, Blue Velvet is incredible. I've seen Blue Velvet many times. I think Mulholland Drive is David Lynch's best film, but Blue Velvet is up there too. This is a masterpiece. Pierre Le Fou, I've never seen that film, but Godard died recently, so of course he should be represented. Celine and Julie Go Boating. I've heard that film has been compared to Mulholland Drive about the identity between two women. I've never personally seen that one. A Matter of Life and Death. So I love Powell and Pressburger, and I think they definitely. I don't think that Matter of Life and Death is their best film. I think Life and Death of Colonel Blimp is a masterpiece. One of the, Pressburger is one of the greatest screenwriters ever, and Michael Powell was a very innovative director. I'd love to see Life and Death of Colonel Blimp instead. You've also got Black Narcissus. You've got really any of their films. Peeping Tom, which they did not make together. And I think The Red Shoes is higher up on the list. Modern Times, of course. Sunset Boulevard, of course. Spirited Away. Now, I saw Spirited Away recently, and that's one of the most heartwarming stories ever. I don't know if I've ever cried as much. I cried so much during Spirited Away. A beautiful film. And this is something I'm very passionate about. This is when I talk about Persona 5 and how some people stick their nose up at that because it's anime. And I say that we should get rid of classifications of genres because, of course, you can have different genres. You can have different themes. There are always different themes in a work. But to say something is to say, like, the point that I use is Spirited Away is one point where people used to say they would stick their nose up in animation and say animation has to have a different category. It cannot be the best picture, it has to be the best animated film, or it cannot be the best picture, it has to be the best foreign film. And like they used to say with once The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, that it was a spaghetti western, and so it could not be art, is what Roger Ebert said, quoting what was said about it, not what he thought about the film. And Spirited Away, to see it on here also with another Miyazaki film right next to it, I think Spirited Away is one of the best movies ever made. But it's a beautiful fantasy film, full of imagination. It's a very heartwarming story, and definitely one of the greats. I've never seen Journey to Italy. La Ventura, rest in peace to Monica Vitti. La Ventura is, came out in the same year as La Dolce Vita. I like both films a whole lot. Two of the greatest films of all time. Metropolis, The Red Shoes, again, another one of Powell and Pressburger's. A great film. And really, I think, Deborah Kerr and Anton Walbrook, two regulars in their films, two of the great actors. I'm not a huge Tarkovsky person. I think Andrei Rublev, probably one of his best films. He is a great director. Casablanca speaks for itself, probably just as relevant now as ever. The Third Man. It's often said that Orson Welles had the best character introduction in cinema history in The Third Man. I still think, again, Citizen Kane, he has equally, if not an even more memorable and impactful introduction. Of course, The Third Man, pairing him with Joseph Cotten, once again, one of the great acting partnerships on the screen ever. Goodfellas, I remember seeing Goodfellas first on television when I was younger, probably like 13 when I saw it. And fascinating film, absolutely fascinating film. I don't agree with what Roger Ebert said, that it was the finest film ever made about the mob. I still think The Godfather is better, but they're two amazing films and about slightly different aspects of that life. But Goodfellas is great. And Moonlight I do want to talk about, because Moonlight, I actually did see Moonlight when it came out. I was actually very impressed by it. It's one of the few films that I saw multiple times. I saw it like 3 times in a row. I saw it 3 or 4 times in one day. And there's only one. I think it's a great love story. I think Moonlight is a great acting, great performances, some great characters, and very well told visually. There's like one minor like technical error that bothered me with my OCD, but that has, I suppose, nothing to do with the film. The film itself, I thought it was there was a controversy at the Oscars. They announced the wrong film, strangely. It was Faye Dunaway, I think, who announced it, one of my favorite actresses, actually. Moonlight, I think it was one of the best films in the last couple of years. That's a film that probably does deserve some recognition, so I like Moonlight. I'm glad that it's here. La Dolce Vita, of course. The Apartment, of course. Battleship Potemkin, one of the most influential films ever made. One of the films, there's obviously the iconic carriage shot, and of course, Sergei Eisenstein really helped to, Sergei Eisenstein, sorry, really helped to codify the idea of the montage, one of the great film theorists. Blade Runner, often said to be one of the greatest achievements in cinematography. I think it was Jordan Cronenweth that was the cinematographer. I think Blade Runner is good. I saw it a long time ago. Harrison Ford, great. Rutger Hauser, I think, who died a few years ago. He's a great actor too. Um, Daryl Hannah. It's a good film. I don't think Blade Runner is a masterpiece necessarily, but it is very influential, of course. The 400 Blows, a masterpiece, one of the great, just one of the great films, one of the great coming of age stories, of course. I often said North by Northwest was my favorite Hitchcock, but I've actually never seen the whole film. But Cary Grant is great. There's one of the greatest images ever when he's running from the crop duster. It's a great film. The Battle of Algiers, I still haven't seen it. Supposedly it's, a masterpiece, a great documentary, sort of hybrid of documentary and theatrical production. Barry Lyndon, I've talked about it a lot. Got a video talking about it. One of the most beautiful films ever made visually. And again, I think that Barry Lyndon shows you what Kubrick was really about, which not many filmmakers were interested in or able to portray, which is opportunism. And it's the greatest story ever told, probably, about opportunism. That's the entire theme and the message of that film. Uh, but everything about Barry Lyndon is a beautiful film. Stalker is another one of Tarkovsky's films that I do. I've never watched it, but I think there's some fascinating imagery from that film. I've wanted to get into Tarkovsky one day. I might. Stalker, not a bad selection, probably. Rashomon, um, definitely another one of the most influential films for its narrative structure from the great master. Again, I never saw Bicycle Thieves, but it was the original best film of all time in the 1952 poll. Rear Window, saw it a few years ago. Love James Stewart. I think Grace Kelly's in the film. Uh, it's an absolutely great suspense story. Some Like It Hot. Billy Wilder, I've always said, actually, since I didn't really speak much about him. I think Sunset Boulevard, I might not have mentioned that. I think that he was, along with Hitchcock, the one of the. I mean, he had an extraordinary period in the 1950s, incredible films that he made back to back to back. So him and Hitchcock were the best directors of the 50s, I think, and there's no one quite like Billy Wilder. Then there's Breathless. I think it's Godard's best film. Some iconic imagery and quotes from that film, very important. M. I'm a little fuzzy on the details of M, but again, another film, another classic film with lots of memorable and quotable moments. City Lights, as I've already spoken about. Uh, I guess I was wrong. I guess it actually is in both the critics and directors list, as it should be. Um, Pather Panchali, one of Ray's films and his series of films about India. Psycho, of course. Mirror, I've had a discussion with people about Mirror before. Some people think it's a masterpiece. I always said there's not much of a plot going on in that film, but they said that the memories were the entire point. It was all about that was I don't know. It's a very important film to Tarkovsky. Um, for me, it's not one of my films, but it's up there. 8.5. Taxi Driver, I think it's Scorsese's best film. I think it's one of the boldest films ever made. I think it really opened up the Pandora's box. Not the first of its kind, but it was really pushing the envelope for the kind of violence you could show on film. Obviously, one of the greatest character studies, as Tarantino said, he couldn't even think of a better character study. It's De Niro's best performance, without question. The most, along with Mean Streets, the films that he really brought the method acting. I don't even think method acting, just he was a chameleon in that role as Travis Bickle. I think it's a fascinating film. Incredible cinematography, the score from Bernard Herrmann, the great Bernard Herrmann. Uh, And Paul Schrader, who voted in this list, and I read what he said about some of the selections, and he thought it was sort of social justice warrior propaganda, which may or may not be true. I think I know what he's talking about. Um, there's a lot of old choices and new choices here. Again, it's just a compilation of different lists that people have. Of course, it's going to be some propaganda, but I do think that the number one choice, um, we have to even get to there. The Night of the Hunter, saw it a few years ago. One of the scariest movies ever made, and one of the greatest moments in a film between Robert Mitchum and the great Lillian Gish when they're singing the song. Of course, for different reasons, but their duet in that film is so powerful. There's Balthazar. I've seen a little bit of Balthazar. Apparently, it's about the donkey who is abused by humans and cast away, and then he dies at the end of the film. And it's a film that a lot of critics have spoken very highly of for its emotional weight, and I think I can understand why it would have that. Do the Right Thing, I think, is a masterpiece. Um, it's really beautiful. For example, the scene, the little montage of all the people talking directly into the camera and telling the others how they feel about them, their little racial insults. It's a great film. It's an entertaining film, and it's not really escapism at all. It's a film, in some ways, in a sad way, is all too real, like real life. But it's a very relevant film then and now. Um, Passion of Joan of Arc, often said to be one of the greatest performances in cinema by the actress. Seven Samurai. Now, of course, this film I think is probably Kurosawa's best. I actually remember seeing Yojimbo, the first time I saw a Japanese film many years ago, because I wanted to see the film that helped to inspire. I don't want to make this video too long. To help to inspire the Dollars trilogy. Of course, Toshiro Mifune's performance is Kikichio is one of the most iconic characters ever. He's been translated so many times. In Neo 2, Tokichiro is based off of that character, partially the characterization, and he's one of the great actors, of course. Apocalypse Now, Persona. Of course, Persona the game is better than Persona the film, but Persona the film is good. The Searchers has one of the greatest endings of all time. If you had to make a top 10 list of the greatest endings, The Searchers, which obviously influenced The Godfather, as far as the ending, just the look of the film, but the ending is so beautiful where Ethan Edwards, he's not the hero. He saves the day, but he's not the hero, so he is an outcast once again, and he kind of stumbles off into the middle of nowhere. It's a beautiful ending for a character that is not really a good guy, but also not the worst guy in the world. But it's a very moving portrait of a man in a difficult situation and in that time period where there was a lot of morally gray people back then. I don't know what Cleo from 5 to 7 is, but I'd like to go back in time and meet the actress that plays whoever that is in that film. The Rules of the Game. I've seen a little bit of that a few years ago. There are some moments in that film that are really timeless and memorable, but I've never thought that was, as Paul Schrader said, all that cinema can be. I don't know about that. The Godfather is as interesting as, that's not only just a great movie, great escapism, fascinating. It's just some of the greatest performances I think The Godfather has. Brando's greatest acting, really. I don't remember how I used to say it. Both probably his best performance and best acting, because I think that he really disappears into the role of the mafioso. I love this scene. Probably my favorite scene is the scene where he. I think The Sopranos got it wrong. There's this scene in The Sopranos where AJ is like, that scene in The Godfather where he gets the revenge at the diner. No, that's not what the movie's about. It's about the scene where Vito goes and he talks to the other mobsters and he says, "I swear on the souls of my grandchildren, I will not be the one to break the peace we make here today." I think that's one of the most honorable things any character's ever done in a film. Of course, he has selfish reasons, as he says, but it's an incredible performance by Brando, also Pacino. James Caan died recently. All around, one of the greatest casts, directors, screenplays, cinematography by Gordon Willis, everything. Godfather speaks for itself. This video's kind of get long, so I don't want to go too much, but I mean, at the same time, I might as well keep going. This will probably be one of my longest videos. I love Singing in the Rain. I already talked about it. Man with the Movie Camera is obviously one of the first film experimental documentaries. Mulholland Drive at number 8. I'll actually comment on all of these probably. I don't know what number 7 is, but Mulholland Drive at number 8 I think is so heartwarming to me, and also Singing in the Rain. But Mulholland Drive, to see a movie, only in the past few years be so good and considered so highly is amazing. In my life when I was just a kid when it came out. Fucking beautiful movie. It's just incredible. 2001 at number 6. Now this is where I do want to highlight this. This is contentious here. So I don't think In the Mood for Love. I have no idea what number 7 is. Beau Travail. I don't know what that is. But In the Mood for Love at number 5. I saw In the Mood for Love a couple years ago because I wanted to see if it was as good as people said it was, and it is a good film from what I remember. It's about two people who are in a loveless marriage, basically, and they're both preoccupied by not only their work lives, but their marriages at home are not going. Both of their spouses, I believe, are having affairs themselves with each other or something like that. And it's about the unrequited love between the husband and wife that are not married, but they're thinking about having an affair to spite their own spouses that are having an affair, if I remember correctly, and they don't do it because of honor or whatever the reason is. I thought it was a good film. It is. I don't understand. I I don't know. I don't know. I liked it. Maybe some people really loved the film. I don't think it's the fifth greatest film ever made, ahead of all of the others. 2001 at number 6. Um, but like I said, love stories are my favorite types of films. I just like Tokyo Story, for example. To me, is far more moving than In the Mood for Love was. But not a dishonorable film, I don't think. Citizen Kane, of course. Vertigo, of course. And then number 1 is the real contention, Jean Delman. I've never seen it, but I've heard about it many times before. I don't know how the hell it got to be number 1. This is what a lot of people are complaining about. I haven't seen it. It's probably an interesting film. I don't know where it came out of to be number 1. I really don't understand how that could be more captivating, more moving than Tokyo Story or Vertigo or Citizen Kane or any of these other films. Even in the top 10, I don't know where it came from. I couldn't have even told you where it ranked the last time, and I really don't know if that many people, just average moviegoers, would find a whole lot of value in it. I don't think it's the peak of cinema as an art form or anything like that. So it's a very strange choice. I don't know how he got so many votes. It was also number 4 on the director's list, which I want to talk about now just very briefly. I'm not going to say much more than what I've already said for the films that I've mentioned, but because I didn't expect to go on a whole hour talking about this, but there, might as well. There's a lot to cover, and it's just what I like to talk about. So, and the directors poll, a lot of the same films, but in a different choice. I do think it's great that 2001 made it to number 1 this time. Last time it was Tokyo Story, which is down to number 4. And The Godfather is way up this time. I can't remember where it was last time, but there's some big movements there. To have 2001 at number 1 is an excellent choice, probably the right choice, because I don't know if there's any film that's ever covered, all of human history in one movie, essentially. Well, you know what I mean. We started as apes, and then we fast forward to where we are now, and then there's the future where we're going next with AI and whatever the next step is. So I love 2001. That's a great choice. I'm not going to go down through all the lists, but similar lists, I think, I don't know. My list is my list. There's so many great films. There's more great films than there are great video games, but movies are always important. They've been important for 100 years. They'll still be important. I don't think that where movies are now, they will never be what they used to be. I definitely think that video games are where we are now with video games. It is really the next step forward that we've always been looking for, if done right. I don't think video games should be movies. I think you can have a movie just for the sake of a movie. I think that movie making is part of a great video game, but and with something like Persona 5, I think is where you take movies and all these other forms and you put them in the run to one and you go beyond. That's incredible. But there's a fine line. But just watching movies, as Roger Ebert said, it's a passive experience. As we all know, it's a passive experience, and so it's somewhat limiting, but still more or less universal. So of course I always love going back to talk about cinema because it's all the same. I think we have to, as far as the value is the same. We need cinema. As Herzog said, we need to have adequate imagery or we will die like dinosaurs. So celebrating the good films that tell us about our humanity, that are mirrors that reflect something about ourselves. We need to always remember those. And these are some of the ones that are timeless, very inspiring, many of them. These are some of the greatest films ever made, and that's some of my thoughts on these lists. And of course, there's a lot of lists. So I was happy to share mine and my thoughts. I don't know if I'm sure someone else is looking for other opinions as well. If you have any opinions, if you actually got to the part of this video, you should tell me what some of your favorite films are.